Now it was said that once all of the Africans could fly, but due to their transgressions, they lost their wings. But still, there were some on the South Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas who could fly, but no one knew because they looked like normal people. Now, during slavery, there was a master on one of those islands who was more cruel than others because he worked his slaves until they died. And then he'd go out and just buy some more. Now, it had come to the point where he had worked most of his slaves to death. There were just a few left. And he went to the market and got a whole new group. And this group had just recently come from Africa. And he sent them right out into the cotton fields. Now among them was a young woman who had just given birth, and she had her baby at her breast, wrapped around, as other women in the field had their babies wrapped either on their back, on their hips, or on their breast. But this woman shouldn't have been out there because she had just given birth to her first child, and those are usually very difficult births. But she was out there working. And the driver, who was the man who made sure that they worked, was out there near them. Now the baby started to cry, and she took the baby and said some words to her that the driver didn't understand, and put the baby on her breast. And she kept working as best as she could, but she was weak and tired, and she stumbled and slipped and fell. And the driver came and lashed her back until she stood up. And near her was this tall, old man who had come with them, an African. And she looked up to him and spoke to him, and he answered, but the driver didn't know what they said. And the young mother kept working as best as she could, but again, from the heat, she got tired and slipped and fell again. And the driver came and lashed until she stood up. And she looked up at the old man, and he said, "Not yet, daughter, not yet." And so she continued working again. And then she slipped. But the driver was a way off. And she looked up at the old man and she said, "Now, Father?" And he said, "Yes, daughter, go in peace." And he extended his arms so, and she leapt up and stretched out and flew over the fields and over the trees and out of sight. And the driver couldn't catch her. And now he was angry, and they were trying to make the other slaves work harder. And it was high sun, and the heat was hot. And a man fell, and the driver came and was lashing him, and he stood up. But as he stood up, the old man said some words that the driver didn't understand. But that slave that had been lashed looked at the driver and laughed and lifted his arms, and he was up in the sky. And he flew over the field and over the woods and out of sight. And then they kept working, and the sun was still hot, and another man fell. And this time the overseer came, and he was beating the man. And the man stood up, and the old man said those same words and extended his arms, and that slave lifted up and flew out over the land. And they kept working. But now the master had seen and the overseer was seen, but one other slave fell, and the driver and the overseer and the master started to run because the master yelled out, "Get that old man, he's the one doing this." But he lifted his arms, and that man got up and flew away. And as the overseer and the driver and the master was coming, and the master had torn a picket off a fence with the idea to beat that old man to death, he stood in the middle of the field and he said words that the master and the driver didn't understand. But all the black people in the field stopped and heard him. And as he spoke, they recalled the power that had once been theirs. And in one movement, they all lifted up off the ground. And the men were clapping their hands, and the women were singing, and the children were laughing who weren't on the breast of their mothers. And they all stretched out and flew high and over the field like a flock of crows. And the old man brought up the end, and he was laughing as the driver and the overseer ran after them. But they kept flying over the rivers, over the woods, and all the way to the rim of the world, and disappeared like leaves in the sky. And so it was that same remembrance that rested in the heart of every slave. And many of them did escape. And many wondered how it was that black people were able to endure. It was because they knew and remembered that power and quest for freedom, the freedom of knowing who you are and knowing that no human being can take that from you. That was the freedom that got them through slavery, that got them through the Underground Railroad, that got them through the Civil Rights Movement, and continues today. And not only with the black people, but all people who people think are oppressed. Everyone has that freedom to fly away.